that death is actually the kiss of God, not a sting at all. It stings only the ego, that we may be released into the truth of our being. And so when we are meditating, we are practicing dying through letting go. And through silencing the mind. But because the ego mind is in flight from death, if we are going to reach death, we have to give up our fear of it and transform the fear into love. Into love for the very thing that the ego fears most. And that's why the first commandment in every religion is, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, all thy soul, all thy might. But the ego can't love God because God means death. The ego is terrified and in flight from the very source of salvation. But when the ego turns with love to that source and is willing to die into silence, then the flow of love from the very source of our being becomes a wave of tremendous force, tremendous power that washes over us and through us and permeates our being and dissolves the ego and all of its fears at one moment. And this is the act of grace. But it won't happen because God is merciful until we're ready for it to happen, until we wholeheartedly desire to dissolve in this love that is the only force that can redeem our essence. And if we one-pointedly hold the silence, either as an act of love for God, or if one is not in a dualistic mindset and one doesn't have belief or faith in God, and it's not an outer God somewhere else but the source of our being, if one can turn within and ask, what is the source of my being? Who am I really? Then, with the devotion to the very question itself, even if there is no love, but the devotion to truth, one will reach the same place. The love will make it an easy journey, whereas the desire for it at the level of truth will require more willpower. But if there is sufficient honesty and courage to face the truth of what we are and the emptiness and the lack behind all of the false fronts of the ego, we'll reach the same place without any belief, without even any faith that there is something to reach, as long as there's complete honesty. But the good news is that as one faces the unknown, the great mystery within, with or without faith, as one opens to whatever is the truth, the power of that love will be felt within. It will wash through us whether or not we have belief. And the luminosity will liberate us from all the bondages of the ego. Namaste. El problema para el ego es que el mundo es un espejismo. The world is a mirage. And because it's a mirage, no matter how much you consume of it, it will not bring satisfaction. So this is the ego's problem. The ego itself is a mirage. The ego itself has no essence. It's a construct of thoughts, images, memories, emotions. But it has no essence. And so it constantly has to keep proving its existence even though it knows better. And it does that by trying to consume the world. At chakra 1, it'll consume the world as food. At chakra 2, it'll consume as much of it as it can in terms of sexual objects. And at chakra 3, in terms of rage and domination and control of the world to whatever extent the ego can get away with it. But all of these efforts prove empty and self-defeating. And they leave the ego ultimately devastated and bereft. Because it's impossible. And once one enters into this world of illusions, one finds mirror images. The same illusion one is projecting, one's same desires will be there in the ego in front of you, desiring the same thing. And suddenly there's a rivalry and a competition and a power struggle. And so we have all these non-existent egos fighting over a non-existent world. It's very funny, really. And the only way you can win this struggle is by surrendering the very intention of trying to get what isn't there. And as soon as you give up that effort, you realize, oh, all the time, I was what I was looking for. I am that. I am that essence, but not as an ego. And that's what happens in meditation. We give up this illusion of being an ego in the world that is maintained through our thoughts. Constant, incessant production of thoughts. Here's the whole capitalist system in microcosm. You produce in order to consume. Produce thoughts, project them out, and then consume them back. And then find that they were empty and weren't worth producing in the first place. But that's the cycle. It goes on. And then one convinces oneself, well, it's just because it wasn't enough or it wasn't high enough quality, and one's tastes become more and more refined in terms of what one is hunting for. But it's always still externalized, and one never looks back and says, well, who's doing the hunting? Who's doing the avoiding? Who's doing the manipulating and the distortion of one's own experience in order to get a false sense of satisfaction? It can't be maintained except either by recruiting others into the same falsehood, or by dominating, or by rejecting and withdrawing. But in a state of ego, one cannot create community because there is always the rivalry and the struggle and the need to be on top of the pyramid. So one is always stuck in a sense of lack, dissatisfaction, producing agitation, anxiety, anger. And then that gets repressed. Defense mechanisms are put in place so you don't realize the misery that you're in, and then suddenly you're living in a tiny little box of your comfort zone and pretending everything is fine. But of course it isn't, and sooner or later the karma comes back. And only by dismantling this entire structure that we've created can we realize that all along the real self is the state of peace, of being, pure being. Being that needs nothing, that desires nothing, that fears nothing. Because it is nothing. It is nothing in this world that doesn't exist, but it's everything beyond the illusion of the world. And when you are meditating and you reach the state of silence where the mind isn't producing the illusion of a world any longer, not even a dream world, a fantasy world, but in the pure silence of a mind that is motionless, still, fully present, the self emerges as consciousness, not only into consciousness, but as a pure consciousness that is blissful, that is filled with love, that is filled with joy, with bliss, with ultimate satisfaction that can never be lost. But it's a satisfaction that does not depend on any circumstance. And when that self is able to then enter into the field of the ego consciousness, it's able to then overcome the projections, the fantasies, the mental structures, and transform that world of illusion and mirage into a
Yoktum. Yokluğumun farkında değildim. İyilik ettin, var eylettin beni. Anıl